It's time to accelerate. Hi, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Join me as I host conversations with the leading experts in sales, marketing, sales automation, sales process, leadership, management, training, coaching, any resource that I believe to help you accelerate the growth of your sales, your business, and most importantly, you. Hey friends, this is Andy. This episode of Accelerate is brought to you by Kitedesk. Kitedesk is the all-in-one sales development platform that lets you manage all of your sales development activities, such as email, direct dial phone calls, and your daily to-dos, all in one place to open up conversations, book more qualified meetings, and really create predictable pipeline.
Kitedesk Flow and Kitedesk Find allows us to find exactly the right people in the industries we're looking for, in the roles that we're looking for.
That's Kitedesk customer Michael Orphis. Michael is head of sales at Stratified. In addition to the all-in-one management of his sales development team's days, Kitedesk helps him with another big part of his job.
We have the ability with Kitedesk to do what we call targeted campaigns. Our conversion rate from what we were doing in the past to what we're doing now has been really massive.
So you don't have to take tons of time to research, prospect, then blast large lists of people that never turn into sales opportunities.
We're seeing higher clicks, we're seeing higher open rates, and without question, we've seen a massive increase in pipeline generation.
So, to learn more about Kitedesk, schedule a free demo, and learn how to create predictable pipeline at your sales organization, go to kitedesk.com/accelerate. That's KITEDESK.com/accelerate. Hello, and welcome to Accelerate. Joining me on the show today is Frank Cespedes. He's the senior lecturer at Harvard Business School and author of the book Aligning Strategy and Sales, as well as numerous articles on the Harvard Business Review about sales. Frank, welcome to Accelerate.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Andy. My pleasure to be here.
So take a short minute and introduce yourself and maybe fill us in a little bit of your background, how you got around to teaching sales.
Well, in some sense, I've always taught it. My background is, fairly straightforward. I was your standard issue business school professor at Harvard Business School for a number of years. And my research always concerned go-to-market, channels of distribution, and sales. Then I left academia, ran a business for almost 12 years. And,
what type of business?
We were a software firm, but the software in many ways was an excuse for the professional services we provided in the learning management space.
Okay.
But, when you've got to meet payroll, you have a new existential respect for sales. Then after getting lucky in business, I could give you a different story, but that was the truth. We sold at exactly the right time. Harvard called me back up to be a professor, and I taught strategy for a few years, and I was surprised by what I didn't find. Arguably the world does not need yet another strategy book. I also know the world does not need yet another particular sales methodology book, but there was nothing to connect the two, nothing about the link between strategy, assuming you've got one, and what that means for customer acquisition and retention. And yet, when you look at the numbers, and people are always surprised by these numbers, U.S. firms alone spend over $900 billion annually. Now, annually means every year. Over $900 billion annually on sales. That's not marketing. That's 3 times as much as they spend on all advertising, Super Bowls, everything. It's about 20 times as much as U.S. companies spend on all digital marketing, and it's almost 35 times as much as they currently spend on social media. I always quote Mark Twain when I cite those numbers. If you're going to put a lot of eggs in one basket, keep your eye on that basket. And very, very little written about that link. That's why I wrote the book that I wrote.
Well, those numbers are fascinating. So we spend 3x the amount on sales we spend on sort of conventional, advertising, as you talked about. And how many times what's spent on digital marketing?
Well, the numbers there are a little cloudy because, what people now call digital, the amount spent on digital marketing is probably exaggerated a bit because it's a way to sound 21st century, but it's at least 20 times what people spend on digital.
And yet, as you and I were talking about before we came on the air to start recording the interview, was one of the real crises, I think, in sales is that, at least based on the research that's being done, is that there's this huge spend, and yet we're not really moving the needle in terms of productivity improvements. I mean, there's been an explosion of technology and sales technologies and sales enablement technologies, and yet the reports that come out, the research is done showing that close rates in the business-to-business space are actually declining year after year. That the same percentage of reps aren't making quota. The number of percentage of deals that end up in no decision are increasing. 50 to 60% of deals in pipelines that no decision. It seems like a real inflection point for us.
Well, it is, and I think the numbers are even in many ways bigger and even more interesting than that. There was a good study done by McKinsey about 2 years ago. And when you think about the impact of the Great Recession, the so-called Great Recession that's, depending on how you date it, starts in late 2007 or 2008, I think these numbers become a bit intuitive. But what McKinsey found is that if you look at the average S&P 500 company, motivated by the absolute necessity to cut costs, the average S&P 500 company has cut its cost of goods sold about 300 basis points. Now, that's a big deal. That's a very big deal. When you add up what that means, that's close to $1 trillion. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you look at SG&A, selling and general administrative expenses, they've not gone down. They've actually gone up as a percentage of sales.
Well, as you said, intuitively they would if you've cut your costs that way.
Well, no, I think what's intuitive is that you cut your cost of goods sold as a response to a long, sustained, severe recession. What is not intuitive is that your SG&A goes up, and that's a big deal. And what you see going on, I think, is not just a sales productivity issue, although it is. I think you're exactly right about that, Andy. But what you see going on is a big inflection point in terms of productivity studies. The reality is that most companies have actually done a pretty darn good job on cutting their costs. And by that, I mean what they do in shared services, their back office costs. Mm-hmm. Operations improvements, manufacturing improvements, and so forth. But they haven't done a good job in becoming more efficient and more productive in their go-to-market. But I think that's where you see increasingly the focus of productivity studies, and it's there for the same reason that the famous bank robber Willie Sutton robbed banks.
That's where the money is, right?
That's where the money is. That's exactly right. And I think this has implications in a number of areas, but one is for what it means to be a sales leader in the 21st century. And it's increasingly difficult to hide. What those tools that you alluded to do is provide people in the C-suite, and in particular finance people, with more transparency, more information, more data about what is and is not happening in the enormous amount of money that they spend on sales. And what was traditionally a sort of black box, sales is what the salespeople do. I think those days are fast disappearing. And it's going to be very, very important for a sales leader not only to master the processes in sales, which is a big job in its own right, but to be more literate and articulate about the finance and other areas of productivity that are important.
Well, it seems like one of the artifacts that we're seeing, and this is still early days, right? I mean, it's just in the last 3-4 years, there's been this veritable explosion in the amount of sales technology applications and systems that are coming out. And so I said it's still early days, but one of the the things that we're seeing as an early artifact of this greater transparency, if you will, is, and this is an issue that I have that I think is sort of misplaced focus, is there's a focus on activities, right? The amount of activities, where it's more about quantity versus quality. And so, now we've got greater visibility up and down the chain in terms of what's happening in sales. And the response is, well, to do more, as opposed to necessarily do better.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I think it's a very, very complex issue, however. First, I certainly agree with your main point. Activity is not the same thing as an outcome.
Right.
And whatever else sales is, it is fundamentally a performance art. It is about outcomes. You either close the sale or you don't close the sale. You either get the price or you don't get the price. So simply to measure clicks or, what happens at this stage of the funnel short of that outcome is very, very myopic. I agree with that. On the other hand, there are lots of things that are relevant factors in generating a sale besides the heroic efforts of good salespeople. And, what you do in marketing at the beginning of the funnel counts. What your pricing structure is counts. What you do in your online media, the so-called last click issue. All of those things count. So while I agree with what you're saying in general terms, I think, there is a lot of let's measure what we can measure as opposed to the ultimate productivity metrics. There are reasons for that. And one of the reasons is that it is complex to measure what actually causes the sale, and is getting more complex as customers clearly use online media to do research about products and prices and competitive offerings and so forth.
Yeah, I just had finished reading a book, I don't know if you'd read it, called Absolute Value by Simonson and Rosen about, like I said, the subtitle is what truly influences customers in the age of nearly perfect information. Some Harvard or Stanford grad school, business school professors. And it's sort of interesting, they talk about, there's this common misconception that all this information is overwhelming for buyers, and through their research, what they're finding is actually, buyers are actually really adept at finding the information they need to help them. They define this term as absolute value, sort of being able to understand the experienced value or experienced quality of a product before you buy it. That there's research showing that buyers are actually very adept at that, and that as a consequence, some of the conventional tools of influence begin to wane in importance in terms of their decision making.
Well, I'm not sure I'd go as far as making that kind of generalization. I think, as always in business, the answer is it depends. It depends on the product. It depends on the service. It depends on the category. Certainly, there are many areas, lots of consumer goods, where, as a general rule, I guess that generalization holds. But there are other areas of software are a good example. The value in the product is what an economist calls usage value or experiential value, meaning that you don't know what that value is before you use it. And it often, it really doesn't matter how many online sites you can go to. You have to use it in your particular organization to understand that. So I'm not sure that
but from a decision-making standpoint, you have to make the decision before you get to the usage value, though.
Yeah, but there are lots of ways that those folks make that decision, and there are lots of ways that sellers encourage them to make the decision. I mean, look at the traditional SaaS businesses that are so common out in your neck of the woods, right? We have the free tier, and then we have the tier that allows you to do X, Y, and Z that you pay for. And then we have the premium tier that allows you to do even more. All of those are ways to move the customer through what is fundamentally a usage value purchase. But purchase decisions are not necessarily binary. They're not just yes or no or all the way. The world has always been and still is much more complex and interesting than that.
Oh yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's one of the problems that we have in sales in general is that, and I think, the SaaS sales model is sort of an exemplar of that is that there's this attempt to sort of reduce everything to black and white and to process and to sort of say that it's all a science as opposed to saying, yeah, there's still a fairly substantial human element involved in getting the customer what I call the last mile from whatever they can learn online and so on to answering those final questions that make get them to the point where they're going to make a decision and a choice.
No, I agree with, and I think that's one of the great paradoxes about sales. And here I do think the research is fairly definitive. If you look at all the elements of the so-called business value chain, if I can use that kind of MBA jargon for a second, all the activities from sourcing to operations to selling and service and so on. Sales is arguably the most context specific. In other words, what works in industry A doesn't necessarily work at all in industry B. In fact, what works in sales at company A in the same industry doesn't necessarily work in company B because of that company's strategy, the target customers, the buying processes of those customers, etc. At the same time, for some reason, sales is the area of the value chain where people feel most empowered to make these huge, big generalizations. Sales is all about relationships, or sales is all about this particular SaaS model. And I do think if we look at tech in general and my reading of the blogs, basically what we have are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who make these generalizations based on n equals 1, their particular experience at that particular company. But it hath always been so. Right. It had always been the case that sales is very, very context specific, but also susceptible to these huge generalizations. And, at the end of the day, I think that's what separates good business people from mediocre business people. They're the ones that are not suckers for the glib generalizations and do their homework.
Well, but I think that we have sort of an example of that. I mean, at least in my opinion, is take the SaaS business. I mean, there's a new business model for selling software that, sort of determine the need for a new sales model. But, people look at this new sales model as, a savior. And the fact is, as you said, it's really context specific. And, the failure rate of startups, hasn't changed because they're using this new sales model.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there are a couple of things there. One is, like any model, it gets developed, it gets refined, and it gets mature and saturated. Now, if you sort of think about how the SaaS model, and I assume that what you're referring to there is primarily an inside sales approach,
right,
with SDRs, BDRs,
right.
Content marketing, etc. A couple of things to be said about that. It is no coincidence that it took off circa 2008, 2009. Essentially, you needed a lower cost go-to-market. Secondly, I don't think it's a coincidence that if you look at the human resources that staff that model, they're mainly, at least at the SDR stage, fresh out of undergraduate types. And, during a recession, those people have trouble finding jobs. They're willing to take those jobs. And some of those models have worked very, very nicely. But boy, that's an increasingly saturated space. Increasingly what we call content marketing, we used to call the yellow pages. So lead generation is increasingly difficult in that model. And as with any model, it's about the entire process. It's not about any particular portion of that process.
Right. Yeah, but my point is it's sort of been touted as sort of the end-all, be-all. And to your point, it's becoming saturated. You're seeing it. I had a conversation with a VP of sales of a high-profile startup in the Valley, actually been at multiple companies, and just his fear was that, just to your point exactly, is that it's just becomes saturated. It's increasingly difficult to attract the attention of the customers, and they almost feel like it's sort of being used sort of a slash and burn strategy.
Yeah, but I'm a bit optimistic about that, Andy, because as you know, there is no such thing in any competitive economy as end-all, be-all. And when you get people, and especially investors, either talking or acting that way, smart, clever people disrupt that model with more interesting things. And I see no reason not to believe that's not going to happen. And it's good not just for business, but it's good for society.
Well, but to a question you and I had talked about a little bit before we come on the air, is that, I'd be interested in what your thoughts are on this, is because, we've seen, assuming this, I'll call the SaaS model, the inside sales model has certainly been disruptive to some degree. But when we see the research reports about sort of some fundamental measures of performance throughout the sales business, is they're really unchanged or getting worse, slightly worse on a trend basis, over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So what's your thought about, so what's really can disrupt, the basic productivity of sales?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are going on. And, productivity is a mystery in the general economy for economists. As you would expect, because productivity is actually, is ultimately the outcome of human behavior. Mm-hmm. And when you find something more complex than human behavior, I'm all ears. Let me know. But I think there are a couple of things going on. One is we are living through an inflationary and innovative period with sales enablement technologies. And there's no reason not to believe that, as with any technology, it takes people some time to figure out what, in fact, it really is good and not good for. And we're still in the relatively early days of that. So comment number one is give it a little bit of time. Comment number two is most of those studies look at technology-based businesses. SaaS is a good example, right, where, the price curve, is not exactly one that cheers up investors. The price curve in many of those businesses looks like a ski slope in Aspen. So if by productivity we mean how much is sold by a salesperson, price has something to do with that. Sure. And then number three, I think, is a managerial issue. And that is that ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, it's about understanding the buyer, understanding the buying process that's relevant in your business. Selling is always more about buying than it is about selling. And understanding that any of these tools, any of these technologies are enablers. They are not the end game itself. And, while that sounds obvious when someone says it, it's a truism that, as far as I can tell, every generation of managers has to re-experience for itself.
Well, that's an interesting point. I'm sort of chuckling at that because, getting back to your point about endless sales books that exist out there, is I think part of the reason that we see this continuing sort of cycling and recycling of sales methodologies, if you will, is that there is no carryover from generation to generation. It's like every new generation entering the workforce into the sales force has to relearn these basic truisms, as you talked about.
Yeah, but again, I'm a bit more sanguine and optimistic about that. I think you are describing the reality But the reason I'm a bit more sanguine about that is the following. Business is not physics. The important things in business are relatively easy to say, right? Be customer focused, make sure you focus on buying, etc. They're relatively easy to say, but darned hard to do. And so I have no problem with people putting old wine in new bottles. I think that is one of the ways that a social activity like business does get better and better. You know, the Challenger sale, which at least for a few years, my sense is it's, sort of beyond the horizon now. Mm-hmm. But, for a few years was very, very popular. As far as I could tell, what Brent and others did was repackage what we've always known is true in B2B sales, and that is it's a really good idea to get specified. Right? But I have no problem with that. I have no problem with putting new words, new frameworks around perennial truths if it actually moves the meter in the organization. And I do think you do see that constant recycling in sales, but sales is in large part about motivation, and I think that's part of what motivation is.
Well, okay. So, well, let me ask another question. It's slightly orthogonal what we've been talking about, but it's, we've been talking sort of about generalizations to some degree. And in a recent article you had talked about the Pareto distribution of sales and sort of said that, everyone sort of believes it's true across the board, but is it actually true? I mean, has anybody ever, sales basis, has anybody ever done any research that you're aware of that says, yeah, this is really the case?
The case you're talking about is the variance.
Yeah, that 80% of sales come from 20% of salespeople, and that.
Oh yes, no, I think a number of research studies support that, and in many cases it's more than 80%. The fact is that variance in actual performance in sales is much more than it is in many other areas of business. And again, I think once you think about this, you can see why. Sales is ultimately what takes place in the marketplace, right? Mm-hmm. Value in any business is ultimately created or destroyed out there in the market with customers in a competitive, changing environment. And that's qualitatively different than, for example, manufacturing productivity, where we've got more control over our factory and our operations. It's qualitatively more complex and different than in our human resource policies, where we can set those policies. And as a result, what you see in studies that go way back and studies done today is that the productivity of salesperson A versus salesperson B in the same firm varies by 3 to 5 times, 300 to 500%. Mm-hmm. Right. For me, the most interesting one that I've seen is a study of retail salespeople at the same counter. In other words, they're at the same counter selling the same products, and there the average variance is about 200%. So yes, this is not speculation. This is, as close to empirical fact as you're going to find. There are such things as stars in sales organizations, and they're very, very ubiquitous across sales organizations.
So let's take that example, the retail counter, because what did the study say that accounted for the 200% variable between people standing side by side?
Well, I hate to put it this way, but some people do work harder and smarter than others. That accounts for the majority of the variance. They're better at presenting the product. They're better at selling. They're better at connecting with the retail customers. They often develop a clientele and, as a result, an annuity revenue base. All of those things that one sees among a good, highly productive salespeople across industries were also true behind the retail counter.
So where does it start, though? This is something that's really interesting to me. Is there's I think there's this dichotomy. Is be interested to see what research you've done or seen on this. Is that a lot of training done on skills improvement for sales, but to me, it seems like it really starts at the more basic level of, sort of basic behaviors and habits, right? I can't train somebody to become more skilled at questioning unless they're in the habit of asking questions to start with.
Well, yeah, and I guess I always point to three things as the places to look at and continually be good at in building a world-class sales organization. The first is hiring, because it is about people. And here, the research tells us that hiring practices in general in business, but especially in sales, I don't know any other word to use, are abominable, just terrible.
Right.
Classic examples of the cloning bias. In other words, I sit down with you, and after an interview or two, I am outrageously confident that on the basis of those interviews, I can predict your actual on-the-job performance. And the research tells us that the vast majority of managers have no right to that confidence. In fact, and this is not an exaggeration, Andy, what a lot of the research says is that many, many companies would literally be better off not interviewing when they hire, but instead picking resumes at random. It's at that stage.
And I'm not surprised by that at all, by the way.
What do you do to get better at that? One is you get serious about hiring. You go beyond these generic job descriptions.
Right.
And most importantly, you do what I think more and more companies are actually doing. And that is you not only do interviews, but you have all sorts of behavioral assessments, and for that matter, on-the-job behavioral assessments as well. Because again, sales is about behavior, but you begin with hiring. And again, the data here tends to surprise people, but average turnover among salespeople across industries in the United States averages between 25 and 30% annually. Mm-hmm. Now, what does that mean? That means that for most companies, every 4 years or so, they are in effect having to hire, develop, train, socialize the equivalent of the entire sales force. Any human resource investment of that magnitude demands rigorous oversight. So that's hiring. Second, for me, is the most underutilized lever for affecting behavior in sales, based on my experience, is performance reviews. Busy sales managers very often don't really do performance reviews. They do what I call drive-by reviews that are not really about development and evaluation. They tend to be, you will or won't get your salary raise discussion. And that is a trainable skill. It is a trainable skill to get people better at performance reviews. I wish I had spent more time and more money in the business I ran around performance reviews, and most companies have a long way to go in that area.
And so what's an ideal frequency for the performance review?
Well, I think that varies depending on the company, but certainly at least once a year and probably much more often. But it leads to my third point. What do we know about development of people in any activity, but especially a creative activity like sales, is feedback is important, but also what you do after the feedback for follow-up. And what performance reviews need to do is to be linked to the other elements of performance management in a company. That would include training. In sales, it would include ride-alongs. It would include all sorts of informal coaching that in a good sales environment take place. But in answer to your question, those are the three things that I point to. They're not exotic. I think they're fundamental. Hiring, performance reviews, and then the follow-on training and other performance management practices.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, for me, hiring, you have to test for the skills that you need in the job. I mean, if you're going beyond doing so the rudimentary job description you talked about, if you're putting together a set of job specifications, is if something that somebody needs to be able to do in the job is you need to test to assess whether they can actually do it or not.
Yeah, but I think you You've got to do that by understanding what really are the sales tasks.
Yes.
And again, sales tasks are determined by your company's strategy and target buyers,
Yes.
not by a generic selling methodology.
Nope.
And then you've got to have things in place that encourage and enable the folks doing the hiring. And in sales, this is mainly frontline sales managers, things that encourage and enable the folks doing the hiring to do more than, looks like me. Sounds like me. This worked for me when I was his or her age. And you can see there are other social implications to that cloning bias, including other forms of bias that have to do with gender, race, etc. It is not a happy situation.
Well, no, and a perfect example is, you look at, and this is especially true, I think, in some of the inside sales companies implementing inside sales that we see is, they got this bifurcation between their SDRs and their account execs. The account execs they call the closers. And so job descriptions are all these sort of testosterone-laden terms, closer, hunter, extrovert, that, don't attract women into the role.
Well, my favorite story, a true story. I remember business I ran, as I said, we had software, but it was fundamentally a professional services organization. And until we reached about 40 people, I interviewed for every job. And I mean every job, secretary, everything. Mm-hmm. And in sales, I'll always remember interviewing this one wise guy. And, I gave him my standard speech, which is that this is a service business. We have big clients. It's all about people. You've got to understand that going in. Are you okay with that? Now, in 12 years, I never had anyone tell me, no, I'm not okay with people. But I always remember this one wise guy who said, people. Some of my best friends are people. Now, that sounds funny, but unfortunately, when you're dealing with the platitudes that describe most sales positions, that is what a lot of hiring managers fall back on.
Oh, sure. I mean, tell me your strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, right.
Another example of a penetrating question, quote unquote. And so, Frank, now we're in the last segment of the show. I've got some standard questions I ask all my guests. And the first one is a hypothetical scenario in which you, Frank, have just been hired as the VP of sales by a company whose sales have stalled out. And CEO is anxious to hit the reset button, get things back on track. So what 2 things could you do your first week on the job that could have the biggest impact?
Well, I mean, the biggest impact is to sort of come up with hypotheses about what is going on. Now, it may be a question of effort. It may be that people are either not working hard enough or smart enough. On the other hand, it may be a question of the marketplace. Do we still have the relevant product and approach? And what you do is very, very different depending upon what that diagnosis is. So, that's number one. I will say this, based on experience, one of the things that has constantly surprised me, and all the data I've seen says this isn't changing, but basically, if you look at sales compensation policies in the United States, the number I'm about to cite has been remarkably stable, give or take a few percentage points for 30 years. If you look at incentive comp and you ask yourself, all right, how does a salesperson who understands his incentive comp plan, and the vast majority do, they just do. If this is how you eat, you will study that plan. If you ask yourself, how do they make money? Basically, what in most 70% of incentive comp plans say is you make money by selling more. And it doesn't matter whether that's a high profit sale or a low profit sale, whether you sold to a customer that's high cost to serve or low cost to serve. So you can see what the message is to salespeople in a plan like that. There is no such thing as a bad customer. Go forth and multiply. And that's what they do. So the second thing I would do is look at the plan, see what the incentive is, and what that means for the orders we are getting. And very often what is going on in many, many organizations is that independent of whatever the espoused strategy is, the real strategy of the company is being determined by that plan. And in effect, what we're doing, and this very often stalls sales, what we're doing is asking some of our customers to subsidize others. And in the 21st century, where there's more information and more transparency, that's a difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. All right, good answer. Love it. So now, just to finish up, we got some rapid fire questions. You can give one-word answers or elaborate if you wish. So when you were out running your business and you had to go out and sell, what was your most powerful sales attribute?
Meaning, what is it I think I did
Yes.
well?
Yes.
At least in our particular space, I knew what I was talking about when it came to the product and at least the going in issues at customers. And I emphasize that because the basics in sales are very, very important. It really helps to know what you're talking about when you're in front of a customer. Now, I know that may sound a bit glib,
No,
but
I was going to say shocking.
Yeah, I have been astounded at how many salespeople do not, and that is a training issue. The basics here are basics for a good reason. Product knowledge, up-to-date product knowledge counts. Now, again, I consider that a necessary but not sufficient cause of being an effective salesperson, but it is a necessary cause. Right. And I'd like to think that I sort of knew where we applied potentially and where we didn't.
Okay. So here's a question, and we'll see if it's appropriate. Is for in your situation. So who was your sales role model?
I had many. I think it's a very good question because I think sales, again, it's a performance art. It's an experiential art. How do you become a good salesperson? The same way you get to Carnegie Hall. Practice. To use the more technical jargon, it's a classic example of what the behavioral folks call modeling behavior. And I think what you find is that what good salespeople do is pick and choose. They see what someone does to develop contacts, and they pick what fits them. They see what someone else does to close, and they pick what fits them. And I was very much like that myself. So it wasn't one individual, but a number of people that I had seen and admired and respected and said to myself, I can do that. There were others I admired and respected. And when I saw the way they sold, I as I say, I admired it, but I just said, I can't do that. I'm not that good. But modeling behavior and many models.
Okay. So other than your own book, what's one book that you'd recommend every salesperson should read?
I'm still a big fan of Neil Rackham's book, Spin Selling. Okay. Neil, unlike most folks who write about sales, every sales trainer has an incentive basically to say my book applies everywhere, and that's just not true. Again, it's a very context-specific activity. And there are two things I still admire about Neil's work. One is he knows where his research applies and where he doesn't. And he's pretty darn clear about that. So there's just good intellectual integrity. And secondly, the bulk of that book is about how to ask questions. We all know that asking questions and listening is important in sales. Surprise, surprise. What Neil does in that book is operationalize it. What kinds of questions depending upon the context. So again, the book's 25 years old, but it's the place where I urge my students to begin.
All right. Great answer. So last question for you is what music's on your playlist these days?
I am a big fan of jazz music. I am a big fan. Who did I just listen to this morning? Bill Charlap. I have no idea whether you know who Bill Charlap and his trio is, but
I'm writing it down as we talk.
And you should get from the West Coast to the East Coast, go to New York. You'll see him constantly in one club or another in New York. And he's one of the great jazz pianists of our generation.
All right. Well, I'm a huge Keith Jarrett fan, so that's on my list.
Well, we share that obsession. I am a big fan of his solo concerts as well.
Yeah, that's my writing music. I put that on. It's like a Pavlovian response. I just start writing. So, all right. Well, Frank, thanks for being on the show. Tell folks how they can connect with you.
I've got a website, frankcespedes.com. And I'm a professor at a business school. And I guess all the other usual suspects these days via LinkedIn and so forth.
All right, great. Well, thanks again. And remember, friends, thanks for taking part of your day to listen to this show. And remember to make it part of your daily routine to deliberately learn something new to help you accelerate your success. And one easy way to do that is take a minute, subscribe to this podcast, Accelerate. That way you won't miss any of my conversations with top business experts like my guest today, Frank Cespedes, who shared his expertise about how to accelerate the growth of your business. So thanks for joining me, and until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone. Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard and want to make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher.com. For more information about today's guest, visit my website at andypaul.com.